So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this project. It was really exciting to see what you're doing with this initiative. This is an area of my passion. I actually am coming at this in terms of the paper from a researcher perspective, but I also have a background in doing actual peace building work. And so much of what I'm talking about in this paper is actually informed by personal experience as well. But the topic of citizen apologies and forgiveness as diplomatic gestures of peace really gets to the nature of looking at apologies and forgiveness as diplomatic gestures of goodwill in terms of using them as a way to improve relations. There's been, in recent years, an increase in research on the role of state apologies and the importance of state leaders making apologies, but there's been very little discussion of the role of citizens, and with an increasing role of citizens now in not only perpetrating conflicts, but also engaging in peace building and citizen diplomacy, it was appropriate to kind of visit this issue again in looking at what role they have in this process. And so this paper actually suggests that many of the historical apologies that we see happening currently by state leaders in many ways really are not being used as official acts of contrition, because there's rarely any type of restitution or anything that's going with that. It's being used more as a gesture, a diplomatic gesture, to kind of reinforce a commitment that what happened in the past or what happened, this act that our state was involved in was wrong, and that we're committing for it to not happen again. And so in the same way, I think citizens have a role to be involved in this type of process. So I'm positioning this under the area of citizen diplomacy, and this involves the role of individual citizens involving in dialogues, activities where they're essentially trying to serve as a representative of their country and to improve relationships between countries. The idea really has come about most recently in very formal peace building kind of activities, but it's also been kind of extended to people just being involved in more exchanges, promoting understanding, those kinds of things to improve relationships between states. But at the heart of it really is this idea of building trust and understanding. That's kind of why we do this. And part of the role of citizens in this process has really been reflected in the recognition of the increasing role of non-state actors being involved in conflicts, and that they have a role to be involved in actually resolving them. And just for example, on September 11th, we know that it was a non-state actor that killed more people in New York City than the state of Japan did in Pearl Harbor in 1941. So we can't just assume that there's no role for individual people. It's an important thing. They have a role in both preventing and resolving conflicts. So basically what I'm talking about in this is that there's a role for citizens to bridge the divide in much the same way that diplomats do. And some of the earliest discussions of citizen diplomacy were talked about in the context of early work that was done before UNESCO was created. And Marshall was a theorist that talked about this in 1949. He said, he says essentially, people rather than states are the ultimate foundations of goodwill, and therefore every possible means must be explored to enable people to plan and participate in expressions of international goodwill. We know that traditional diplomacy has proven insufficient in effectively restoring relationships between countries, and therefore there's a need for us to kind of explore the relational side of conflicts in a much more, I think, concrete way. As was discussed earlier, these macro-focused approaches are not sufficient. Part of the rationale for involving citizens in these processes is recognizing that talking to people, having dialogue, engaging in kind of relational behavior puts people face to face with one another, and it's through those processes that they are able to share their hurt, what had happened, how they were affected at it. It's the personal side of conflict, and then ultimately it should be an opportunity for someone to offer an apology. And in that process, use that as a way to kind of build a bridge that hopefully will result in some type of reconciliation and lasting peace. And this essentially, I think, is what's needed. Apologies and forgiveness are two sides of the emotional coin, with apologies being asking forgiveness and forgiveness accepting the apology. They go hand in hand. And as was mentioned, intractable conflicts cause deep feelings of pain, anger, hurt, and even hatred. And unfortunately, much of the peace-building activities that we're engaging in are neglecting this type of activity. Is people need to hear someone say, what happened to you was wrong. And for whatever connection I have to it, whether it's just being a part of a state that was involved in it, I have an obligation to try to make that right. So basically, I'm arguing that apologies are a social construct. And just as you think of this idea that conflicts are things that happen between individuals interacting one another, in the same way, apologies can be constructed to improve relations. So despite cultural differences, they can be used as a way to diffuse anger and to promote reconciliation. It's helpful to bring people face to face in that process, but there's other ways that it can be facilitated as well, including online type activities. Ultimately, it's about offering some kind of gesture of respect and trust, and it's in that process of dialogue that people start to break down those barriers. When there's been conflict, trust must be rebuilt, and so every effort must be made to use gestures that help to facilitate that. Okay, so at the heart of it, once again, is this idea of building goodwill. It's essentially engaging in a political activity of offering an apology as a gesture of respect in order to build a bridge of goodwill. We also, in this paper, I kind of drew upon the research on intergroup apologies this thing is not working, to show the importance of the face-to-face conversations between people from different groups and having those kinds of conversations to share about what had happened, and in the dialogue being able to offer those kinds of gestures really have a psychological impact on the people. It basically validates their concerns, and it can break down the barriers. And part of the concern has been the fact that some of these acts are considered a kind of collective responsibility. In acts of war in particular, it's the citizens that are engaged to fight. It's very difficult for people who've been wronged to separate their views against a state or a government from the citizens. They often kind of see them hand in hand. So there's a need for those people to be a part of that process of building those bridges. The idea of collective responsibility isn't really about guilt, it's about moral responsibility. It's an ethical responsibility as being a part of a group to find a way to move beyond what had happened between those two groups. It's connected to the idea of collective memory, and there's quite a bit of research on the impact of collective memory and how conflict and harms that have come to a particular group can actually be carried through generational lines. And it's reinforced through stories that people share and activities that people are involved in, that people continue to hold these kinds of offenses even when they weren't actually personally affected by it. So collective memory is deeply connected also to the idea of collective identity and how you see yourself. You identify as sometimes being a victim of something that had happened. And so it's coming to those situations and recognizing that those psychosocial really baggage still exists in many ways, and that people have a role in trying to find a way to heal those hurts. So just quickly, I looked at two case studies in this and drew upon the case of Bosnia, the conflict with Muslim, Croats, and Serbs that involved a great deal of violence. There was rape, there was murder, there was concentration camps. And although there was a formal peace agreement in that situation, what my research found is that was lacking among many of the survivors was the fact that no one had ever expressed any remorse. One person said, "There was no remorse. No one has apologized or even admitted what happened. A deep form of reconciliation in that situation is what's needed and necessary, and unfortunately it has not happened. And in many ways, until we get to the point that that happens, where the cycle of violence could continue." And the other case study I looked at was one that involved relationships between Libya and America. This is actually something that I was personally impacted by. My brother was one of the victims of the Lockerbie terrorist attack that happened in 1988. 270 people lost their lives in that attack. It had a deep effect on relationships between those countries. And what I decided in that situation was I wanted to find a way to build a bridge of reconciliation. So as a single person kind of went on this mission of trying to find a way to personally forgive. And that took me on a trip to Libya, where I actually met with individual citizens. And it was through dialoguing with people that I started to recognize that they also had a very deep sense of pain because they were subjected to sanctions for many years because of Gaddafi's involvement in terrorism, that they had also suffered at the hands of Gaddafi themselves and continued to suffer, and that we have things in common where we could kind of stand with one another in solidarity and try to work through things. So that caused me to then eventually start an NGO called the Peace and Prosperity Alliance that took me to Libya to do conflict resolution and peace-building type work. And what I found is that there's a power in bringing people face-to-face and citizens, and it created an opportunity for me to be involved in Libya in a time where very few people were involved. And it started with people just simply saying, I'm sorry for your loss. And then for me to say, and I'm sorry for what happened, when your family was affected by the US air raid in 1986. And it was those kinds of things that eventually started to help me understand that there is a power of these individual citizens that isn't just between those people, but it actually has an impact on others who hear about it as well. So dialogue can have a compounding impact, because in my situation, I ended up having the opportunity to be on CNN and these kinds of things, and it took me in a lot of more high-level media opportunities just because of making that first step. And ultimately even had a face-to-face meeting with Muammar Gaddafi when he came to speak at the UN. And in that type of meeting, it was the same kind of thing. It was really just sitting face-to-face, sharing about what had happened, my expressing the fact that I had made a decision to forgive, and him, even in that moment, the fact that he kind of denied what happened or that he was involved, he still said, I'm sorry for what happened to you. And so the impact was quite profound, not just to me, but for people that heard the story as well, because they saw the human side of conflict being, really acted out in a very concrete way, and people are moved by that. And so it's those gestures and overtures that I think are the building blocks of long-term reconciliation. Some pictures of some of the work that I did in Libya. There's me meeting with Gaddafi and some of the peace-building work that I have done. It started in 2004, and then it continued into before the revolution, during the revolution, and after the revolution. I actually had a chance to go to Libya and actually teach conflict resolution training as well. So it's something that I believe very strongly in the power of that. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that essentially, I think citizens' apologies and forgiveness are important tools of citizen diplomacy. They're really designed to be a part of the reconciliation process, where people in those conversations don't just ignore the fact that something happened to this person and that they are looking for someone to take responsibility. And it may not be the state that's going to do it, but as a person who's part of that group, to what extent your being a part of that group is seen as somehow connected to it gives you the opportunity to at least share the fact that there's a level of shame or regret that you have. And that can actually be a very powerful thing for people to hear, that someone's saying what happened to you was wrong and I recognize that, and to reinforce that. And it recognizes the emotional side of conflict and the fact that memories do continue, and that ultimately we should just continue to reinforce those gestures throughout the years. And I found also that even today, the continued process of reinforcing apologies for past acts are seen as important gestures to committing that these things are not going to happen again. So as much as citizens have a role in that process, we don't completely have control of what our states do, but we do have a role to be a part of in that dialogic process of building trust and goodwill between states and the citizens of states. Thank you.